By the end of this video, you will know how to dismantle the Caro Kann fantasy variation from Black's perspective. So, what is the Caro Kann fantasy variation? Well, it arises from the move order e4, c6, d4, e5, and f3. And the point is that if everything goes according to White's plan, White will get a fantastic position where, let's say we take this pawn, White has a beautiful center, White has very easy development, and Black is stuck with this awkward c-pawn, which obstructs the development of our knight, and Black is less developed and has much fewer space. We're going to play the line that I recommend and the line that has been played the most in recent times, which is e6. Now let's talk about the plans and ideas behind the fantasy variation. So after the move f3, White significantly weakens these dark squares. So if I were to ever castle kingside, it would be a dangerous commitment because the moves like queen b6 are possible, which target this whole diagonal and make White's king quite exposed. Meanwhile, our light square bishop is our biggest drawback. It's very, very passive and is difficult to develop. We're going to try to develop it with moves like b6 and bishop a6 in some particular variations. However, most of the time, we're going to try to place a knight on d7 and play e5 in order to open up this whole diagonal for our light square bishop. Because in the middle game, all these pawns are going to get traded off at some point, even these ones, and this bishop is going to be able to develop itself to either e6 or f5 in due time. Additionally, White's going to have to find a square for this knight. It cannot develop through f3 because there's a pawn on f3, so White's going to have to place something like knight e2, which is a very, very awkward square, and hopefully we're going to be able to capitalize on that. And even though that the Caro Kann fantasy variation has gained popularity in recent years, it's somewhat of a dubious way to play against the Caro Kann, against especially a well-prepared opponent, because it's just not enough, and Black always retains equality or even a slight advantage. So let's quickly cover some of the minor lines, and then we'll move on to the main lines. The main move here is knight c3. However, sometimes White will try things like moving out the bishop right away with bishop e3. As soon as this bishop moves out, suddenly this b2 square is very weakened, so immediately we just play the move queen b6. It's the same as if White's bishop were to move to f4. We would still play queen b6 and have the same idea. Here, White is forced to weaken the dark squares by playing something like b3. Or White is forced to sacrifice a pawn with something like knight c3, after which we can just take on b2 and this is a completely free pawn. So, early bishop moves do not work for White. Let's say the bishop moves out like this. We can just start with simple moves like knight d7. And this is very, very nice. I don't think developing the other knight first is a good idea because you want to keep this bishop open so you can pin this knight on c3. So the knight on d7 is very flexible because you're preparing both e5 and c5. Generally, in these types of structures, you're going to actually prepare e5 rather than c5 because otherwise this bishop is going to be very difficult to develop and it's going to be stuck for the rest of the game. So this resembles somewhat of a French type of structure, and so e5 is a very prominent idea in these positions. If we get an early queen move, such as queen d3, here I really like the move b6, and the point is you're going to develop your bishop through a6, and you're going to get basically rid of the bad bishop with tempo on the queen. So this would be a very big mistake, but it's a mistake that a lot of players actually make. Keep that in mind. Also, another minor line here is sometimes White will play e5, which is, again, transposing into a close French structure. Here we don't need to worry. We're going to just simply move c5 and everything's going to be fine. If White were to play c3 here, this transposes into a Caro Kann advanced variation, except this pawn is on f3 and very awkward, so Black is doing good here. The main move would be probably f4. That's the only way I can see to justify playing this sort of structure. But then again, you waste two tempos, or you waste a tempo by playing f3 and then playing f4. And after something like takes and just regular development, Black's completely fine. And Black is arguably better in this position because these dark squares are super weakened. White wasted a tempo, so there's just no advantage to be found here. The reason I played knight f3 instead of queen takes is because after queen takes, knight c6 comes with tempo, and it's a very, very annoying move for White to play against. So it's logical for White to just develop this knight first and then exchange pieces. But after something like knight takes, I would recommend to steer away from taking this knight. Don't trade unless it's on your own terms. And here I would just play something like bishop c5, for example, or knight e7. All right, finally, let's cover the main move, which is knight c3. Here, the biggest and most popular move is definitely bishop b4, and it's the move that I will also be recommending. I believe it's the best move you can play, and there are a multitude of moves here. Some of them are much worse than others. First of all, let's discuss the very obvious ones, like a3. If we run into a3, we're not going to back down. We're going to make this necessary exchange. So we're going to sacrifice the bishop there, but we're going to double the c-pawns for white, and then we're going to take this e-pawn. And what is the point, you say? Well, if the f-pawn recaptures our e-pawn, we're going to play queen h4 check, and now white is forced to sacrifice this pawn, and black will just be up an entire pawn. If, for example, I don't know, g3 was played, we get this fork on the rook, and if the king moves, we just take this pawn. So now the king is exposed, the pawns are doubled, and black is up an extra pawn. The difference in this position versus taking right away, let's say, is that you have to play e6 first, and in that time, white can develop very easily with moves, just very simple moves. Even e5 works in this position. So you will not be able to get this nice queen h4 attack with the queen unless you play e6 first. So after knight c3 and bishop b4, a3 takes, and after we take this pawn, obviously the recapture is not possible because once again, queen h4 check. So always keep that in mind. That is a very, very thematic idea in this sort of variation. Queen h4, so early queen check might win you a bunch of games. And here the main move is queen e2 for white. The point is to recapture with the queen, fairly obvious move. Here we have to play and strike right away with c5, and with the point being that if this pawn were to recapture, we would once again just be up a full pawn. That obviously does not happen. And if the queen were to take this pawn, we could extend our development with knight f6 and put pressure on the queen, so this would come with tempo, and our development is just much better. Because if you look at white's position, white has double pawns, and the only developed piece is the queen. And the development of this knight is going to be very difficult considering it cannot go to f3, which makes this position very passive. Therefore, if we can achieve this position as black, this would be great for us. So after c5, this is a very odd move. I highly doubt most of your opponents will see this, but if they do, I mean, kudos to them. I guess they studied this line. They're going to play queen e3, which again supports this pawn. And it spends another, I guess, tempo. So instead of developing other pieces, white is just moving their queen around. And after this, we have a multitude of moves. I would recommend just playing knight c6, and you're completely fine here. Once again, if either of these pieces take, we know what we're doing. And we're just going to aim to trade off pieces and keep our extra pawn, or get a huge initiative from development. Okay, we've covered the a3 variation now after this move order. And we found out that it doesn't actually work that well for white. So what about some more, I guess, natural moves like bishop d2? So if this knight, or if this bishop were to capture the knight, white wouldn't have to ruin their pawn structure and would instead place a bishop on a c3. Here the development is very simple. We're going to play knight e7, and the idea is just to place a knight on a nice square, because if we were to play knight f6, I mean, I guess e5 ideas are possible, but also the knight from f6 doesn't do anything. If we play knight f6 here, we can see this knight is staring into squares that it cannot ever access because of this f3 pawn. So the knight on e7 is a much more well-placed piece, because it can always reroute itself with moves like knight g6 or knight f5 in the future when we trade off this pawn, or this pawn gets pushed. From this position, there are pretty much only two moves that white can play, and one of them is knight back to e2, and the point is to just trade off the bishop, and that's exactly what we're going to do. From here, I really don't see the justification of playing this sort of line. I feel like black is completely fine here, and in fact is a little bit better according to the engine, just because white played two moves of the same piece and undeveloped it, and now the only square that this knight can go to is h3. So from here, we're just going to castle, we're going to solidify, we're going to play knight d7, and the point is that we're going to play e5 or c5. Very interesting thing in Caro Kann games is generally you're always going to play c5, you're never really aiming for e5 moves, but in the fantasy variation, you might want to consider e5 just because it makes developing your bishop a real possibility, whereas playing c5 makes this bishop really stuck in this position and quite useless. So from here, I'm not going to continue any of the line. There isn't really any forced lines. White has multiple developing moves here, and our ideas are very simple. Again, we're going to just e5 or c5. It really depends on your personal preference. I prefer e5 in this position. We're going to develop our queen c7, b6, and we're going to try to get this bishop out, create some pawn breaks maybe, and just aim at the weak pawns and use our better development in a stronger, more solid center to gain a small advantage over white. Now, instead of knight g2, what else can white play? well, white can play a3 in this position, and instead of taking this knight as we would do in the previous position, here I think it's the best to slide back, because taking the knight is dubious. You're sacrificing the bishop pair for absolutely nothing, since you're not ruining white's pawn structure in any way. Therefore, it's I think this is the best move. You're still applying pressure on this knight, and it just seems more natural to me. And after something like bishop d3, you're going to, again, put your knight on d7. So one thing to keep in mind is, in these sort of positions, the development is very, very similar, and you can pretty much transpose into each position if you really want to. You don't really have to worry about memorizing, lines of theory, because once again, the ideas are almost the same, so the lines are almost always going to be the same as well. Here, once again, I'm going to showcase this e5 move, and let's say white takes this pawn. We're going to develop this knight, and now look at this. We're attacking this bishop. This bishop cannot really defend itself. This bishop has potential for development, not right now, because obviously these pawns are preventing that, but eventually the straight is going to happen one way or another, and from there we can place our bishop on f5 or even e6 if we really want to. So this seems to be a completely fine position for black. In fact, the engine agrees it's minus 0.5 in this position, so it's a great way to play. If white decides to not take this pawn, which I'm not sure what exactly they would do, let's say they would take this pawn. Once again, we've pretty much achieved the goal. Now we can develop this bishop very nicely, but we're just going to recapture here. And after white castles or brings the bishop out, we can do whatever we want. I would suggest just taking this pawn, and you're going to be completely fine. So after something like bishop takes, castle, and yes, we do have an IQP position here with this d5 pawn, but targeting is quite difficult. Once again, this knight doesn't really apply much pressure to it, as it's pinned to the king, and we can always capture it. White's pieces are very, very awkwardly misplaced. This knight on e2 just seems very passive, and we can create a lot of pressure with moves such as, let's say, knight c6, and pursuing this bishop, and then pushing this pawn and creating some sort of attack or some sort of break. Now, this covers bishop d2 in its entirety, so now that we've covered that, let's move on to the main line, which is, I'd say, the most natural line for white, but one that is very, very playable for black. Here, white displays bishop f4, and the point is, you're not contesting this knight in any way. You're just applying pressure, you're just taking space, you're just developing your piece to a very nice square. This prevents us from placing a queen on c7 or d6, and it just puts a bishop on a nice square. Once again, we're going to play knight e7 here. Alternatively, knight f6 is possible. At a very high engine depth, it actually really likes knight f6, but the problem is we're not engines, we're not supercomputers, so unfortunately we're not going to be able to calculate 40, 50 moves deep. Therefore, knight e7 is just a much more simpler move. If white ever plays a3 in these sort of positions, and you notice that the knight is not protected by any other piece, so if we were to capture it, only the pawn can capture back, I strongly suggest that you take this knight, because that means white ruins their pawn structure, right? And if the bishop was protecting, just slide your bishop back, or if the queen was protecting, once again, slide the bishop back. That way you're applying pressure on the knight and the queen, and the position is just completely fine. Here, this might remind you of the a3 chapter originally, where we captured this pawn and afterwards play queen h4 check. However, in this position, and this is very important to keep in mind, if you take, it's a blunder, because afterwards white gets a very nice strong center, and we don't have queen h4 check because, well, this knight. And if we were to play something like knight g6 in order to start queen h4, white slides his bishop back one square, and now queen h4 is impossible. This pawn is not targetable, and white has a lot of space and very decent position. So after something like this, just develop with knight e7, prepare castling, prepare e5. Actually, in this particular position with the bishop on f4, and this is one thing I should have mentioned, bishop f4 does prevent e5, because now there's two pieces attacking the square. So after bishop f4, you can prepare c5, and it's a completely viable alternative. Your compensation is in the fact that white has doubled c-pawns in a very, very awkward way of developing this knight. Meanwhile, you're going to have very easy development. You're going to have a very strong center. However, your bishop's going to be quite passive. So you're going to attempt to develop it with moves like b6 and maybe bishop b7 or bishop a6, whichever one works for you. But overall, this position is slightly better for black and very, very playable. After bishop d3, we can just castle. And after like knight e2, we start c5. So on the idea we just discussed earlier. If white takes this pawn, we can recapture with the knight. Again, if you take with this pawn, this is slightly worse because now you have an isolated pawn that you're going to have to focus on protecting for the whole game. Whereas capturing with the knight, I mean, look at this. You're targeting both of these pawns. sorry, you're targeting this bishop and this pawn. Your knight is on a very, very nice square right now. It's super active. And this pawn is very solid. The structure is super solid. So you don't have to worry about any inherent weaknesses as you would have to worry about with the move pawn takes, because now you have an IQP position. And here, white has multiple moves. There's no specific line that you have to abide by. It's just playing natural moves. For example, let's say bishop g3. I mean, you have queen a5 ideas right away. Actually, in this position, you could even play knight e3 and just target this queen, make it very, very annoying, and then follow up with something like pawn takes, and then, I don't know, queen g5. Basically, your position is completely fine. It's very, very intuitive. In the fantasy variation, there's no such thing as memorizing 20 moves of theory. You just have to follow the right plans, play smart, and everything's going to be just fine. Now, if I were to play into this position, it's kind of unlikely that they would play a3. So let's say they play something more natural, such as bishop d3. The point is pretty simple. We're just trying to get rid of this pawn, take some of the central space back from white. Here, no matter what white plays, let's say they take this pawn, we can take back with the bishop right away, but this isn't even a necessity. In fact, we can just castle. After a move like a3 now, we can choose and pick, but I would just take and then play queen a5. And so you're going to win one of these two pawns eventually. You also have ideas with d4 because this pawn is pinned to the king currently. But at the end of the day, you're going to have a very intuitive position. Your development is simple with knight c6 and then knight g6 targeting this bishop. You can develop your own light square bishop through moves like d7 and then try to somehow get over there. Or b6 and try to, if this pawn is traded off, you can play b6 and then place your bishop on b7 or a6. So just to sum up, I didn't really show you guys that much theory in this video, and I feel like that is justified by the fact that in the fantasy variation, you're not really accustomed to playing all that much theory. The ideas are very simple. We're just placing our knights on e7 and d7, and then we're planning on pushing either e5 or c5. And the point is to break this pawn structure and take away some of white's central control. All in all, I think that placing this bishop on b4 is our biggest asset and is going to lend us a very, very comfortable game, regardless of what white plays. So next time you guys face the Caro Kann fantasy variation, I strongly advise you try this thing out and see how it goes. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this informative, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.